Yesterday, Trump made the White House security to clear out the lawn from the peaceful protesters so that he can walk across the street in front of a church for a photo op. And he did that because he can. I mean, there is no reason for him to do it, but he still did it just because he can. And that kind of outlines the whole issue we are experiencing right now with this Black Lives Matter movement. It's not that the cops are innately bad per se, but they do what they do to minorities and other people because they can. It's the power. I would like to believe that people, when they get into any organization, such as police, they come with a good intention. But once they get the taste of that power, either the system corrupt them or I don't know, they are susceptible to that power so much that they don't care about the other people altogether. And there is this lot of argument that their first job is to protect themselves and whatnot. And clearly that's not the case. Because if you go and ask any military personnel, any army, any navy, any marine corps, and ask them like what is their first job, they would never say that their first job is to come back home safely. That's a that's definitely in their mind. But their first job is to protect the mission, right? Implement the mission and also protect their friends and whatnot. So when the cops go out there, their first job is to do the same exact thing. It's their job to protect not only their friends from, let's just say, bad actors, if they're dealing with, say, bad actors with weapons, but also their very first job is to protect their mission. And their mission is to de-escalate things, to make sure that things doesn't go out of hand. And time and time, we see that things get ugly. And it's not a new phenomenon in the U.S. history. To be honest, there is a lot of ugliness in the history of all the countries. But just speaking from the United States standpoint, U.S. was in a lot of sense founded with slavery in it. So there is this deep-rooted evilness within the U.S. history. And that slavery, once it was eradicated, literally with a civil war between the two parts of United States at the time, fortunately, the losing side were pro-slavery, and I'm glad that they were diminished. But the ramifications of that still exist to this day, but not to the same degree as it did in the years after slavery, because there was still suppression, division between whites and non-whites. And a lot of those divisions were socio-economic, and also there was like real oppression towards black communities, to the extent that there are a lot of documented cases where white communities, when I say white, I'm specifically talking about white supremacists, they targeted black community, they lynches, they killed them, in front of people, in front of public, and hang their bodies on trees. So there is no justification for any of this other than the hatred within their heart. And this has over the years diluted and is still part of the system altogether. The hard part of all of this is that systematic changes take time. So although it has been 40 years since the last civil rights movement at the granular scale, there has been a lot of uprises here and there for civil rights, and this is another uprise. And I hope that this uprise lead to a drastic, systematic change. Although, to be honest, the way the current political system is aligned, it's hard to expect that from any of the leaders. Trump, for obvious reasons, and Joe Biden isn't best either. His record itself is kind of really shitty, and it speaks for itself. So there is no expectations from him either. So for the next 3-4 years, it's gonna be a rocky ride in the United States for sure. And I bet, like, in a lot of ways, Joe Biden is counting on that, because that's the only reason why people will, as opposed to Trump, because Trump is doing more damage to his own presidency and whatnot. And Joe Biden is hoping on that and counting on that. So I don't trust anything he says. But that being said, coming back to the whole conversation about what's going on today, there is this justification that there are bad apples from, in the police department, which are being violent and causing these atrocities, but overall the organization of police is not filled with, corrupted or corruption. And that's such a bad argument to begin with, because there are so many documented cases that there is a systematic racism and also systematic corruption within the police department. But on top of that, accepting that argument, if there are bad apples from the police side, there are bad apples from the protester side as well. And most, I would say not most, majority, 99%, I'm just throwing up numbers here, but 99% of the protesters are peaceful. And there will be 1% of those protesters who are bad apples and they ruin all the movement. So Trump is now going to use that 1% as an excuse to implement a martial law. It is very crazy, because I don't think in the history of United States the president ever implemented martial law throughout the country. So it would be baffling to see how people will react, especially the people who come up with this Second Amendment argument, that they want to organize against the government when government implement the martial law. And ironically, the Second Amendment guys are with Trump this time. So it would be really a weird dynamic. It's all weird dynamic what's brewing up over here. And one of the reasons I like the United States is because of its First and Second Amendment. I believe both have its value. First Amendment have most of the value. It has the, it is the foundation of the United States, that people can freely express their thoughts, their ideas, their beliefs, and no one should be prosecuted because of it. Unlike a lot of other countries, even in India for that matter, I've seen people prosecuted for expressing their views. And so in that way, United States have nailed it with First Amendment. And there is a value with Second Amendment as well. But in the current scenario, I don't see the Second Amendment guys going to be taking a stand against Trump. In fact, they might even join hands. So it would be really devastating to see the Second Amendment kind of unfold in a very tragic way. But the big question is, what can we do in this situation? I believe there are two things we can do at the personal level as well as at the systematic level. At the personal level, definitely be aware and educate ourselves, because that's the very first gateway to understand the whole concept and what the issue is, altogether. And a lot of people on social media, including myself, we tend to kind of go with the emotions and our mindset at the time, and just start sharing things or expressing our point of view without educating ourselves. So that's actually is uh, it's counterproductive, because when we all educate ourselves about the issue itself, then we will be able to formulate a better point of view, rather than just using the point of views of people we look up to. And believe it or not, the people we look up to, they have their own biases, and plenty of times they actually have their own intention to use their bias and rile up people against each other. And the other thing which we can do is to share our awareness in any shape and form we can, without rubbing it on somebody else's face. Like, for an example, what I'm doing right now is sharing my point of view. I'm not shoving it in somebody else's face, and I'm open to listen to people from all sides. But sharing is very important, and a lot of times even that is corrupted when people try to share based on how they want a virtual signal to a group of people. And that's a tragic, because we have this amazing platforms in the form of social media to express ourselves, express our truth all together. And of course, there are going to be people who will be exploiting it by using the virtual signaling and see whichever group they can, hustle through, or get more support, get more likes from, and they will drift from one group to other group, and that's been happening for a while. The third and most important thing which every one of us can do is to exercise our social responsibilities. For an example, I'm not a citizen, so obviously I don't have a right to vote. But people who do, who live here, as well as people who live in other part of the world, they have a power to exercise their social responsibility in terms of voting and expressing their anger, expressing their pleasure, whatever it may be, in the voting booth. But that's a whole other conversation as well, because voting itself is maligned with a lot of corruption, a lot of I'm blanking on the right word, but it's all. I mean, a lot of in today's term, the voting machines could be easily hacked, and the voters are easily suppressed by the people in power. And they, at least in United States, they have this weird rule of gerrymandering, so that they can create a cluster of communities who can vote for a specific party. And even if the entire state or entire country doesn't reflect the winning candidate, they still have the wrong candidate in office, like Trump, because he didn't win the popular vote. He won the electoral college. So in all, this voting system itself is corrupted here. And I'm sure it's corrupted in most of the countries and dealing with their own problems altogether. And the last thing we all can do is peacefully protest. That's the sign of healthy democracy, to be able to go out there and peacefully protest to whatever you believe in. Sometimes I may not agree with it. Plenty of times I do. There were protests few weeks back from the right side of the political spectrum who were protesting to open the states, when we were still going through the pandemic. And they were protesting to open businesses like massage centers, like hair salons, businesses which doesn't even come under like necessities. But regardless, I understand if they want to peacefully protest for what they believe in, they have a right to do. And likewise, the people who peacefully protest for the atrocities from police department or any other industry for that matter, we all have a right to do that as well. And the bigger point is, it's very easier to see how the organizations act all together, because I personally believe that every organization or ideology is prone for corruption. And you can see this time and time again. There are organizations which start with the right foot, but as they gain more momentum, as they grow bigger, there is room for more corruption. And likewise, you would see that there are people who come into, say, political space with a right intention, but over time they want to keep that power and they either adapt to the system or they become corrupted altogether. And that's going back to the first point, that power begets, and the systematic corruption is the result of craving for that power. And now, what would be the future of all of this? I believe the future has some good solutions, or let me rephrase. I believe that technology will help us resolve a lot of these problems. Especially, I'm counting on blockchain technology, which is a decentralization technology which can decentralize pretty much any organization. It's still debatable how to implement blockchain technology, but right now it's an experiment which is pretty obvious in the economy space with the cryptocurrency. And more organizations are actively adapting blockchain technology altogether. So I'm waiting for the time when blockchain will become so efficient that we would be able to use it in our social life in the form of exercising our votes. I envision a time when we all will be able to cast our vote from our phones without leaving our space. And that would be the ideal time for democracy to thrive, because blockchain will provide this security to ensure that there is no voting suppression or voting corruption, and people would be able to vote from their mobile devices itself. And that will reflect the actual mood of the nation instead of politicians who just use the loopholes within the voting system to gain power. And lastly, I think anyone who wants to be a leader in the public space, especially in politics, let alone in business world, because business world is more private and everyone have a right to do whatever they want to do. But I believe that anyone who is running for an office, they should have to go through some of the trainings. And those trainings should be in the form of meditation. Those trainings should be in the form of mindfulness, compassion. And personally, I believe that they all should experience psychedelics. They all should experience ayahuasca, because that will change their entire mindset, and hopefully they'll be filled with compassion and love. If that's if I can make one change today, this would be it. Anyone who is out there to represent public in the form of public service, in the politics and whatnot, or in the form of protecting people, in the police department or in the military or whatnot, I believe they all should be required to go through an ayahuasca experience, because that will give them a perspective of life itself, of their own life, and also give them a perspective of how fragile our lives are and how important it is to treat each other with respect, with love, and how it translates into our day-to-day action. I personally believe that this one solution would drastically improve our society altogether. So, if nothing else, I hope that collectively all the world leaders, all the public service servants goes through a psychedelic experience, and specifically ayahuasca. With that note, I'm gonna start my daily meditation session, and I will be meditating using Vipassana and a few other meditational techniques I use. So before any... Oh, I gotta also turn on the sounds in the room, so I'll be back in a quick minute. All right, I'm gonna set an alarm for an hour and start my meditation. Great. So I will see you in an hour. Thanks for streaming this live meditation. Until next time, peace.